Hello and welcome to the 8th video in this tutorial series on programming in C. In this video we're going to look at processing user input from the console, and not just one letter or number like we've done in past tutorials, but actual words and more than one. In fact, we'll make a program that will only exit if the user types quit. Before we do that, I've made a little program already in a file called fgets because I want to discuss a little bit more about this part of the while loop here. You can see, and you should understand this from the last tutorial, I've created a basic program with a variable num equals 0, and we start a while loop saying if num is less than 100, then print the value of num, increment it by 1, and here if num gets bigger than 4, then break out of the loop. So that should be fairly self-explanatory. I'll just compile that and run it, and you see we get num is 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4, all well and good. This validation part here, what it's actually saying is, in the while loop between these brackets, it just wants to know, is it valid or not? And as valid, it interprets valid as being non-zero. So if a statement is true, that has a result of 1, so it's not 0. If something is true and valid, it's known as non-zero. So if I put a 1 inside here, this loop will then run and run and run until num gets bigger than 4, because while is evaluating is the expression that's inside the brackets non-zero. So if something is valid, then it is non-zero. And here the expression isn't an even expression, it's just a number 1, but what inside the brackets is therefore non-zero. So if I compile this and run, we get the same output. If I put a 0 inside here, now it'll be seen as not valid because it's 0, so it's not non-zero. So if I compile that and run it, now you can see that there's nothing, the loops don't even start to run. I can even put in here, for example, a character, which again is non-zero and therefore valid, and the loop runs. And that's important when we look at getting input from the user. Okay, so I'll take this away now, and I'll take this away, and I'll take this away as well, because we don't need it at the moment, but we will need the printf, and I'll take this away from the while. So now we can start looking at getting user input. So the first thing we need to think of is where we're going to store the input that we get. Well, we've seen before something called the char variable, so a character, and we'll store it in a variable called user input. But one character is not going to be much use, we're going to need more. So what we can do is we can actually make what's called an array of characters. I'll cover arrays in more detail in a later video, and a semicolon. But here what this is doing, this is telling the compiler that when it compiles the program and then the program runs, please create space for 64 characters. So if you imagine 64 boxes all in a line and each one can take one character, that's what this is saying here. And this is where we'll store our user input, and we'll only store up to 64 characters. So the next thing we need to do is we need to find a way of actually getting input from the user, that the user types into the console. Now we used in one of the previous tutorial videos a Scanf function, which is in this stdio.h header file. The Scanf function, whilst it works perfectly well, has some dangers to it, and one of those dangers is to use it you don't have to specify how many characters you want to read of this user input. And here we have a maximum of 64, and if the user typed in 90 characters and hit enter, and we use scanf without specifying the amount we want to read, it would then write past the memory allocated by this array and would then replace the memory of something else, might even try to do it for another program, and you can end up with, at best, your program crashing, and at worst the blue screen of death on Windows and the whole system crashes. You can specify with scanf the number of characters, but you don't have to, and often you can make slip-ups and not specify the number of characters and end up with problems where you overwrite the memory that's been allocated for you. So better is to use another function that's also in the stdio.h, and that's called fgets. And the way fgets works is you supply it with the array of characters you want to write to. You tell it the number maximum that you want to write, in this case 64, and then you tell it where it should be writing from. So it should be writing from a file, from another process, or in our case it's going to write from the input in the console, which is known as, when you're running a program in the console window, the standard input. And you write that by saying stdin. and then if you wanted to run this here, a semicolon to end the instruction. So the way fgets works, it's what's called a blocking function as well. So when this program, if this program would run now, it would print this, it would declare our 64 characters of memory, and then it would enter the fgets function, which is in the library file here. And fgets gets told, store the input in this 64 character space, store up to 64 characters, and store what was typed into the console. In this case, the standard input is the console. Very good. And fgets simply, when it's called, sits there and waits for input. It doesn't use any CPU power or anything, it just waits silently for input, and this is what's called blocking. So it waits and waits and waits until the enter key is pressed, and then all the characters that were entered, up to and including the enter key, are then stored in these 64 characters, and then the function returns and the program carries on. So in this case, line 10, sit, wait, 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 input, user presses the enter key, stores all of what the user entered into user input up to 64 characters, and then returns and carries on with line 11. And crucially, when fgets returns, it also returns a value, and it returns non-zero value if the user has entered some input, including pressing the enter key. Main, you can see here, returns an integer type. I'll go into functions in a later video, but for now it's just enough to know that fgets returns, when the user has entered something, a non-zero value. And that means that we can take this fgets here, cut it, and place it inside our validation brackets just for the start of the while loop, because as you've already seen when I was using the example with the integer num, we only need something non-zero in here, it can be a character or anything, to then execute the block of code and come round again. So now hopefully you've understood that the way this code will then run is we'll print program start, we'll allocate our space in the memory of 64 characters to store the input, and then we'll start into the while. And the while will look to get validation here to be able to run its code block. So to get this validation, fgets is then called, and we go inside there and wait for input. And when the user then presses the enter key, so this and with the characters that the user types in the console is stored into user input here, this function returns a non-zero value, which is all the while needs to say, okay, good, I've had a non-zero value back, now I can execute this block of code. So I hope that makes sense. So basically what this is doing is getting the input, storing it in here, and the while says good, thank you very much, non-zero, will execute the code in here, and goes around again and again and again and again ad infinitum. So what I can do, I can print the user input to the screen like this, and we can then compile and run this program to have a look at what happens. So I've got program start, and now you can see the console, well, I hope you can see on the video, the cursor here is flashing and waiting for my input, which means that fgets has been called and it's sitting inside this function now waiting for me to type something in and press the enter key. So if I type in a wasp, I haven't hit enter yet. When I hit enter, it will store the WASP and the enter, the press of enter, so a new line character, into user input and return non-zero. It'll actually be returning the string that the characters that I've typed, but that's irrelevant for now, but it's returning non-zero, which will cause while to say, good, non-zero, we can execute the code in here, which will then print user input : wasp and a new line, so it'll go on to the next line. And then the cursor will sit there flashing, because once the code block is finished, as you know from the last tutorial, while then wants to get validation again, which means calling this again and waiting for user input again. So go back to the console and press enter, and you can see we've got user input wasp, and now it's sitting there flashing waiting for input. So I could type B, and we've got user input B, and it's flashing again and waiting for input. Now to get fgets to return 0, you actually have to get it to return an error, which in this case I'm going to press Ctrl and C in the console to kill the process, which will cause this waiting fgets function to return 0. And as you know, when you return 0, while doesn't then execute its code block, it simply goes on to the program simply runs further after the code block from the while. In this case, it'll just print the code program quit, and then the program. So if I now do Control and C, and then you see the program has now quit. Okay, so I hope that's relatively clear. Obviously, having Control and C to quit the program isn't the best or cleanest way to do things, particularly if your program is communicating with other processes rather than you directly typing into the console, so we need another way to do it. And what we'll be using for this is something called the strncmp function, or string compare, with a number of characters specified. And for that we've got this library file here, string.h. If you want to read the details, it's on c++.com, which is always a good reference. And the way it works is this. The function is written so. You tell it what it's comparing, what it should compare it to, in this case we'll say quit, and how many characters it should compare. And what this function does is it takes our comparator here, which is quit, and compares the number of characters specified in the third, after the second comma, in the third place here, the 4, that number of characters with, well, that number of characters from the user input here. So it'll take the first 4 characters, because it's specified here, of user input, pair that with the characters here, which are quit. And if they are the same, the function returns 0. And if they're not the same, it returns something else, a number. So we can say if this function here equals 0, then we know that the user has typed quit. And if the user types quit, then we shall quit. So we shall do a printf and type breaking and a new line. And then we'll break from the loop. Sorry I'm so slow at typing the backslash here, but I have to press Control Alt and then the question mark to get it to work on the Mac keyboard under Windows. Unfortunately, I keep forgetting it. So what this does here then is if the user types quit, then, or the first, whatever the user types, if the first 4 characters start with lowercase QUIT, then we'll break from the loop of receiving input. And that means then we'll just simply drop down to here, program quit will be printed, and the program will end. So let's compile that and have a quick look. So now I'll type in some input, wasp b, again, father, and now I'll type quit. And you can see that it's called the breaking, or printed the breaking, sorry, broken from the loop, and has now quit the program. So that essentially is how a lot of games run, or programs that need some kind of input from either another program or the user. They sit in an infinite loop, getting again and again input from the user or from whatever's controlling the program, process this input, and somewhere in there will be a quit command or something telling it to break out of this endless while loop, and then the program ends. You might call a function first to clean up various bits of memory and things like this, but then you'll finish this code and the program will end. Okay, so that was it for this video on looking at how you get and interpret user input. The next video we'll move on to having a look at arrays, and then we'll move on to looking at functions. I hope it made a little bit of sense. Comments, questions and criticisms are welcome on YouTube as always. Thanks very much.